So I would say let's get started. So first of all, welcome everyone here. Mostly my class, but there should be also a few from campus or from the community. It's a pleasure to have you here. And in case you have not seen or been part of this, this is what basically I do on the side next to teaching and writing publications, right? Directing the EU Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, which is an EU-funded research and outreach center. And as such, it's a great pleasure for me today to have Professor Kellan Anfinson here online. Now, the thing is, he was supposed to be here in person, but he was a victim of the snowstorm that happened, right? So still stuck in New York and cannot get down here till tonight. So we had to move it last minute online. But nevertheless, he's gonna, I'm sure, do a great presentation. So the plan for today would be I'm gonna introduce Professor Anfinson in a second. Then he will talk for about 35, 40 minutes. And then we will have, at least 20 minutes for your questions or for discussion, right? So please take notes of any questions, any comments that you want to make afterwards. But then we will have these microphones that you need to speak into to pose your questions. Okay, wonderful, good. So thank you very much again, Professor Anfinson, to be here. Let me just quickly introduce Professor Anfinson. He is assistant professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies at our sister university, University of South Florida in Tampa. He has received his PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University, one of the best ones in IR, by the way, and has taught and conducted research not only in the US, but also in France, Germany, and the Netherlands. His work focuses on political theory, critical theories, political economy, environmental politics, and climate change. And it has been published in journals such as the American Political Science Review, which, by the way, is the #1 top journal in political science, Telos, as well as the journal New Political Science. It is my pleasure. Thank you very much for being here, even if online, Professor Anfinson. Appreciate you coming. I hope you can hear us applauding.
Yes.
And I leave it to you now to present us Power and Promise, Mobilizing the European Green Energy Transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for the invitation to come. And thank you especially to Christine for organizing a wild itinerary, staying on top of it as it was threatened by the storm, and trying every last minute solution to get me down there, even if we ended up digital in the end. So I just want to say something quick about the title, Power and Promise, Mobilizing the European Green Energy Transition, which is that I want to think about power here in two senses. First, of course, the materiality of electricity that we rely on every day to carry out our lives, but also as a kind of social energy and also potential, form of social control. And we'll be moving between those two levels throughout the talk today. And while we are going to spend most of the time talking about the policy aspects of the European green energy transition, I'm trained as a political theorist, and we won't escape without a little bit of political theory by the end. One last note before maybe we get going is I don't have a good vision of the crowd right now, but feel free to try and interrupt somehow if there's an urgent question that needs to be answered before I get to the end of the presentation. So I need to start by saying that this research was conducted while I was part of a project called ComRes, which was funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program. And I think talking about the Horizon program is actually a good spot to start with thinking about European policy approaches to green energy, because this was Horizon 2020 ran from 2014 to 2020, and the EU put 80 billion euros into all kinds of shared research undertakings, which are often tied to social undertakings as well. And that's been continued under a subsequent program called Horizon Europe. Comres that I was part of received about just under 3 million euros. And though not all of the Horizon research is sort of sustainability related, quite a bit of it is. And so we should think about that. And it's worth taking a moment to think about the structure of that Comres project. Um, as a way of trying to bring about the renewable energy transition. So we were made up of 9 different stakeholder desks in these different countries: Belgium, Germany, Italy, Latvia, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Portugal, and Spain. Um, and I was working on the Dutch desk, and we were very closely coupled to the Belgian desk as well. But even some of these weren't focused so much on the country as a whole, but on particular regions. So in the Netherlands, we were really focused on North Brabant, sort of a small province, and in the German case, they were really focused on the state of uh, Thuringia. And what we were trying to do through that project was, I mean, the goal of it officially was to facilitate the uptake of renewable energy sources in the electricity sector, and particularly the development of RECs, or renewable energy communities, within 9 EU countries, where all of these different stakeholder desks were located. But at the same time, we wanted to analyze why some of these regions or states were very developed, why some of them were behind, even if they had good natural situation to be able to draw on wind or solar power, and what kind of drivers or obstacles they faced, and then to organize conferences, learning exchanges, so to bring local energy communities from these different parts of Europe into contact with one another so that they could tour each other's facilities, see what's working, see what's not working, get inspired to try and do projects in their own locality. And then to kind of disseminate our research and our findings and the results of all of this in policy briefs and technical reports and business model proposals and scientific publications as well. So I think it's quite an interesting way to try and help um, get that renewable energy transition off the ground by engaging the academic literature, sort of social movements, local projects, and the EU governance process as well. So I mentioned a REC already, a renewable energy community, and that's what we were trying to promote through Comres. And I just want to start, we won't spend too much time on this, but this is the official definition of a renewable energy community from the 2018 Renewable Energy Directive. And I just want to highlight a couple elements. First, that and these are going to be the bolded elements here. It's voluntary participation, it's autonomous, it's effectively controlled by shareholders and members who are located in the physical proximity of where the solar installation or where the wind installation is going to be. People who can take part are natural persons, but also SMEs, small and medium enterprises. So small local businesses can also be part of these energy communities, or local authorities. The city can also partake. And finally, the third criteria is that the primary purpose cannot be financial profits, but rather has to be environmental, economic, or social community benefits. And we'll come back a couple times throughout the talk to the significance of giving a legal definition, a legal status to something like a renewable energy community. But it's also worth emphasizing and getting a sense of what they are, just so because they're so central to what the EU is trying to promote as part of the renewable energy transition. Um, and so it's really to promote small local projects that are self-sustaining in many ways, and that eventually will be linked up to larger grids. But if we zoom out to that larger policy focus, then what we're really talking about is the Clean Energy for All Europeans package. And the energy transition is an extremely complex process found across a number of legislative initiatives in Europe. But I think that the heart of it is right here. Um, that was announced in 2016 and completed in 2019. And it builds on three previous energy packages. And since it was implemented in 2019, it's been modified by the European Green Deal as well as other subsequent regulation. And itself is made up of four regulations, which are binding uniform rules across the member states, um, and four directives, which are more principles that guide national regulatory frameworks, but that the member states can interpret or work into their national laws in different ways or in ways that fit their national situation the best or their local situation the best. And I don't think we can underestimate the significance of the Clean Energy for All Europeans package. There's no question that it is one of the most expansive climate change policy frameworks in the global north. To my knowledge, it is the most expensive. And so if we want to see kind of like a positive model for what can be done and what is being done, this would be one of the prime places that we would look. Um, it's also essential because it's the centerpiece in fulfilling Europe's Paris Agreement commitments. But what's even more interesting to me is that the EU is going beyond just we want to decrease greenhouse gas emissions and move to renewable energy in the process. They emphasize other social goods as well. And here they say things, for example, that the clean energy package has the goal of empowering citizens and giving them ownership of the energy transition. Um, and so that's what I'd like to spend a little bit of time thinking about throughout this presentation. What is the nature of that empowerment? What does it mean to give the citizens ownership? What benefits does it confer? But what obstacles does it also raise for European citizens in the process? And what obstacles or benefits does it raise in terms of actually being able to achieve the greenhouse gas reductions that the EU is aiming for? And I've got quite a bit of, not quite a bit, but I've got some quotation throughout the presentation here. All of that comes from the European Commission, unless I've noted it otherwise, um, just so you know. So the argument that I'm going to try and put forward for you today, and I'll be curious to hear what you think of it, is that the empowerment that the EU seeks to put forward for its citizens also places a number of burdens and compulsions on them. And that's because although it is an energy policy and in many ways an environmental policy, it is first and foremost an economic policy. And what the EU, and now we're getting to that question of kind of harnessing social energy, harnessing uh, the energy to bring about the transition, it seeks to use the energy of the market to produce the changes and the reforms, as opposed to something like the power of the state, the energy of the state, right, to do it top down in this way or through society. Rather, it's really focused as a kind of economic program. And that, as I've said, and as I'm going to argue, carries its own um, benefits and obstacles as we go. And so, if we're going to understand that, we need at least to think a little tiny bit about where the energy of the market comes from or how it's been thought about. And I've really reduced this here, but I just want to, give us two separate theoretical images so that we can better understand maybe what's going on here. If we would go to classical liberals, they by and large oppose the state and the market. Everything that the state does to encroach on the market is bad. And markets should be given as much freedom as possible. And if markets would produce a different outcome, then those outcomes themselves should prove a kind of limitation on government, something that the government shouldn't do. But there's really kind of a almost a zero sum between the two. And we can contrast this with various kinds of neoliberalism that have come about in the 20th century. Um, and in all of those models, the relations between the state and the market are not so clearly cut and separated. Rather, they become much more intertwined, much more complicated. They reinforce each other at times, although at other times they also are at odds. And only in that neoliberal sense of thinking about the market can we understand how the state might be able to mobilize the market for its purposes in this way, but also, what that means for the state and the citizens involved. And just as a short note here, I know the word neoliberalism gets thrown around a lot. I'm happy to go into a discussion about that at the end in the question section if people want to. For my purposes, I'm really going to be drawing on one variant of neoliberalism, which comes from Michel Foucault's analysis of German neoliberalism, also called ordo liberalism. And I think those are the characteristics that we really see behind the European green energy transition. Um, so let's dive into uh, looking a bit at the characteristics of those reworked state market relations, that different kind of energy dynamic feeding between the two. Um, First, under this theory of German neoliberalism, the market serves as a foundation for sovereignty, right? So it's not that the state is opposed to the market and every state regulation is a threat to the market. Rather, here, the market helps the state. The market helps solidify the state's sovereignty. Um, and insofar as people participate in the market and insofar as the market is able to effectively produce growth, that can actually serve as a support for the state to strengthen its sovereignty under this theory. The second characteristic we'll look at is that the state power for intervening in market mechanisms is reduced or restricted. And that's sort of, in many ways, classical liberalism, but carried through here. Um, uh, the third is that the state should implement policies to found and expand market boundaries. This again is an interesting break for the classic liberals. The market is natural. It's an institution that comes out of simply the interactions of humans. And for the neoliberals, the market has to be produced. You have to give it a framework. You don't plan it, you don't say which direction it should go, but you set up the conditions under which it can take hold, under which its dynamics, under which its energy can start to unfold. And what we're going to see is that that's very much what the EU is trying to do, is kind of set up new market boundaries for this green energy market to take hold in society at a number of levels. Um, Fourth, the state should also multiply the number of enterprises, right? We want even more competition. We want more people in the market. And as we'll see in the case of the green energy transition, that extends to the individual. The individual household should become an enterprise. The single person should become an enterprise, right? These energy communities become enterprises as well. And so we want to increase the amount of enterprises in society. And the fifth one is that, that builds on everything we've said so far, creating the conditions of intensified competition. That the social goals that we might try and achieve through other means, through politics, right, by mandating a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, instead will be achieved through competition, through the dynamics of the market, through the energetics of the market. And so I'm going to look at the EU Commission's framing and deployment of the green energy transition through these various characteristics, one by one. So first, the market as a support for sovereignty, and it's important to give, I think, some context to the position of the EU when we're thinking about that question of sovereignty, because the EU is both a really fascinating and novel governing experiment in transnational sovereignty. and it's at the same time confronted with skepticism on a lot of sides, perhaps most concretely in the form of Brexit. But of course, Euroscepticism is present in all of the European countries. And interestingly, for a talk like this or for an issue like this, the Eurosceptics are often politically allied or even overlapping with the climate skeptics, right? So that there's a kind of political counterforce drawing its energy against the European Union, both in terms of skepticism of the use of that as a political institution and the goals like climate policies. And so the EU seeks to precisely use the green energy transition as a way to strengthen its own sovereignty. And we can see this in an internal level and an external level. Um, so on the internal level, right, they say that they need an affordable regular supply to create an affordable regular energy supply through a new electricity market design, um, so that electricity can be traded closer to real time, right? To rebuild the foundations of the European energy market that is going to make energy both cheaper and more reliable for people. And that second point, this will improve our energy independence and increase our resilience to external shocks or political pressure. So, right, the more that this green energy transition, the development of this green energy market can be successful, the more internal security it gives, and with that, then the more legitimacy that the EU has in the process through, creating a market that works. They get to increase their sovereignty at the same time. Um, and we could talk about this in relation to the energy challenges that came through the Ukraine war, for example, in the question section, but I won't go into it too much right now. And there's also an external element as well, right? That the EU, on one hand, kind of claims a global leadership on climate change because the clean energy package made it the first major economy to translate its promises under the Paris Agreement into binding laws, right? So this makes them sort of a moral leader for the rest of the world. And at the same time, there's a really deliberate move to strengthen the competitiveness and the place of the euro within international currency. And on one hand, this has to do with, so at the time, the EU was spending about 250 billion euros every year, but not in euros, in US dollars, to import energy. So obviously, if they can bring that down, that helps. But also then at the same time to free themselves to replace the dollar with the euro in more international exchanges. So in that bottom bullet point, in order to increase access to reliable finance and strengthening sovereignty, the European Commission is seeking to increase the use of the euro in international agreements and non-binding instruments related to energy, as well as in energy-related transactions, financial transactions, and energy-related projects. And so I think between both that internal and external focus, we can see that the European Commission is quite consciously trying to elevate the status and place of the EU as a sovereign institution, as a sovereign entity, through the market mechanisms of the green energy transition. Now let's move to the question of reduced state power for market intervention. And if we look at kind of the history, it will be helpful before we get into this to just think about kind of the classic, but not only, model of environmental regulation is kind of like limits, right? We find out there's a contaminant in the water supply and we regulate the industries that are putting that contaminant in it because we find out it causes cancer in babies or something like this. And we don't really care what the market implications are because, we're just going to limit the amount of chemical, right? So there's a kind of political force, a political policing that sets limits. And this is a very classic mode of making environmental policy. But we don't see really a discussion of the limits with the clean energy transition. What we see is a discussion of targets. And this is quite interesting. So the energy package sets three targets for 2030. The first is a 40% cut in greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels. That has increased actually to 55% under the 2020 Green Deal, although since then they've kind of said, well, maybe more like 50. It doesn't look like that 55 is going to happen. At the same time, a 32% increase in renewable energy and a 32.5% increase in energy efficiency. Um, and so these are all very good. They're aspirational. They're, you know, good ways to try and get at a kind of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. But there's no hard limit there. There's no kind of enforcement really to make sure that those targets are met in the classical sense. And I should note that there are two other mechanisms for achieving greenhouse gas reductions, and I'll just speak about them quite briefly. And we can talk maybe more in the questions again if people want. One is the emissions trading system, which is basically like cap and trade carbon market that started in 2005. Certainly up to 2022, the prices didn't get high enough to really have an effect. In 2023, they were maybe getting there, but since then they've come back down. So that hasn't really kind of been a driver of greenhouse gas emissions reductions yet. The other is the effort sharing system, which only indirectly intersects with the question of electricity production, but which, as a form of enforcement mechanism, really only carries bureaucratic burden. So if people miss their targets in the effort sharing system, the member states just have to kind of write reports explaining why they didn't achieve the target and how they're going to achieve it. But that's as far as the enforcement mechanism goes. So neither of those really, again, have the teeth of a classical limits approach instead. Rather, what we see here is setting targets and then letting the market go in an attempt to reach those targets and hoping that it works. The third is state policies to expand market boundaries. And we see this at four levels through the clean energy package. First, there are requirements for a new physical market infrastructure, right? You need the wind power, you need the solar power, you need smart technologies to share that energy across newly built grids. You need a better interconnected European grid, all to allow electricity to move freely and flexibly across borders, and at the same time to spur investment and respond to market crises. So, we're talking about building a market. Well, there needs to be a physical foundation for an electricity market to exist on in the first place. Second, we have the creation of new enterprises. We'll get into that a little bit more on the fourth point here, the creation of renewable energy communities and individuals as energy producers. The third point, right, they want to use public money to jumpstart private investment. So we want to start a financial market around green energy. And the EU committed to around 180 billion a year over the next decade to jumpstart private investment. And to the extent that that financial market really gets going, that can actually help produce a fourth level of a new market, which Nuicer, so this bottom quotation doesn't come from the European Commission, unlike many of the other ones, but where kind of investment becomes an enforcement mechanism on member states that aren't hitting their targets, right? So as Nuicer and his colleagues claim, the close monitoring and transparency of the reporting also gives clear signals to investors, which in turn allow the market to take over and support the transition. So, right, if we see that Belgium is behind in meeting their sort of infrastructure transition or some other aspect of the target, then the idea is that market mechanisms will then shift the investment to the Netherlands or to France or something like this. And so we really get an enforcement mechanism through financial markets. Again, all of these different ways that the market boundaries get expanded through the clean energy package. Fourth, the multiplication of enterprises. Um, and a very interesting component of the whole thing, because right, as the European Commission claims, it's supposed to empower the European citizen, and as they say here, consumers are at the heart of the energy transition. Right. And the idea that the EU has is that individual consumers will convert their energy consumption into an ongoing enterprise through constant monitoring, which is enabled by digitalization, smart grids, smart appliances, new appliance labeling systems, new storage systems, and the Internet of Things. Right. And in a kind of like idealized version that some people paint is, that you have your dishwasher or your laundry machine set to kind of monitor real-time signals in the electrical grid and prices. And so the sun comes out during the afternoon while you're at work. That gives the signal to turn on these smart devices. And you save money on the electricity because it was produced, at a moment where many people weren't using it. Um, and there was a surplus in the system, these kinds of things. So, right, a whole conversion of the household enterprise and your everyday tasks that keep your household going into a kind of monitoring consumption process. And then to even go beyond this, to turn consumers into what they call prosumers. And we could watch a short video here, except that I'm pretty sure videos don't work very good over screen sharing. But basically, the idea is that you're no longer just consuming, but you're also producing. You've got some solar panels on your roof, or you're part of an energy community, sharing a windmill, wind turbine with your neighbors that you've all invested in, and um, and you're both monitoring kind of like the returns that you get, and if you actually sell it back and start generating profits, are you going to spend those profits on another windmill, investing in a second one, or are you going to spend it on something else? Um, uh, and so there's this whole, again, turning the individual or the household into an enterprise around the question of renewable energy. Um, and in order to do this, right, the clean energy package secures a new set of citizens' rights to generate, self-consume, store, and sell renewable energy, as well as participate in energy communities. And that's why something like that definition that we started with of renewable energy communities is so important, right? It's the legal foundation that defines what an entity is, which is then going to be given a right to exist and a right to participate in the market and a right to participate in society, and to engage in various activities that others that the member states can't infringe upon, right? And we can't underestimate the importance of that basic defining of an entity, giving it rights, and then letting it set into motion. And the European Commission has high expectations for what this would be able to produce, right? So, as they say in that bottom point, by 2030, energy communities could own some 17% of installed wind capacity and 21% of solar. By 2050, almost half of EU households are expected to be producing renewable energy, which is kind of, I mean, if you think of what it would take to get 50% of households in Florida to be producing renewable energy and how far we are from that, I don't think 2050 is anywhere close to where we would be able to be. And especially to kind of like produce that capacity and remembering that that's all individually owned. That's all the turning of the individual household into a market participant, into a an enterprise. Finally, the increase in competition and the role of competition in all of this. Um, and I've discussed a number of examples already in this presentation. from the increase of competitiveness in the euro in global finance and in global energy negotiations to the creation of new enterprises in the form of renewable energy communities and prosumers, right? And it's not just that, it's so if we watch that ad defining what a prosumer is, that ad is actually produced by a small company called Sonnen, and they sell these packages to individual households, right? So you have a new company there, and they just kind of sell you the kind of solar monitoring package for your household to produce the energy, to be able to link it to the grid, to be able to sell back at times like this, at times when you're not using all the energy that you're producing. Um, so again, not just that level, but a whole other level of enterprises as well. And finally, kind of the reporting mechanisms that create competition between member states for investment. But I think we can, looking at the language of the European Commission, see them going even farther, where competition becomes a kind of good in itself, a kind of goal, but also a kind of danger, right? We need to right, if we look at that second bullet point, they say we can see their competition as a kind of danger. When the EU is facing greater competition from other parts of the world, it needs to accelerate its efforts in order to maintain its position. So we're afraid of competitors, and to overcome them, we're going to become more competitive, right? So that next one, that competitiveness is a tool to create more efficiently distributed energy supply through greater competition among suppliers and greater variety in the options on offer. And finally, and most tellingly, it's a goal in itself when the EU seeks to, quote, deliver a secure, sustainable, and competitive energy system, right? And it's not that sustainability in that model becomes its own good, or that sustainability is guaranteed, the greenhouse gas emission cuts are guaranteed through some action of the political body, but rather that competitiveness is going to produce sustainability. Competitiveness is going to produce the reductions that we're hoping to achieve in those targets. Um, so what can we draw from all of this? What conclusions can be drawn? Well, first, maybe you've been sitting in this talk and thinking that I'm being a little bit critical of this environmental policy, and I just want to make it absolutely clear that there's a lot that's really good here. Um, uh, I think there's, even at the most basic level, to guarantee citizens the kind of rights to put solar panels or windmills on their home or in the fields behind their houses, to guarantee them the right to sell those on the grid to their neighbors and to the community around them is foundational and exceptionally important. And again, Florida serves as a stark contrast to that, where um, more and more people who insurance companies in Florida are increasingly using putting solar panels on your roof as a reason to drop your housing insurance. And in a state like Florida, where housing insurance is essential to being able to get a loan to buy a house and to dealing with hurricane threats and flood threats and things like this, um, risking getting dropped from your policy when it's harder and harder to get an affordable policy is a real serious obstacle to overcome, right? And although it hasn't passed, there has been legislation proposed in the Florida legislature to make it so that that energy companies don't have to let you sell energy back into the grid if you're producing surplus through your solar panels, right? So those rights, basic as they may be, cannot in any sense be taken for granted. And there are plenty of examples of places where they are not given. And of course, it has produced a lot of good in the meantime, and the progress that it had made helped Europe deal with the energy crisis that came after the Ukraine war started and all of this. So there's a lot of things that are good in it, and we'll conclude even with more. But at the same time, I just want to say that while the European Commission says that this is supposed to be empowering for citizens, I think we'd be better to think of it as a kind of conditioned empowerment. And here we can read this note from Foucault. Liberal practice is an always different and mobile problematic relationship between the production of freedom and that which in the production of freedom risks limiting and destroying it. And I think we see that very much here, where citizens do get the rights to become prosumers, join renewable energy communities, but that they also have to take on all of these extra managerial tasks in their lives, right? It's not just that you use the energy and pay the power bill at the end of the month, but that you're constantly monitoring, you're looking for better devices, more efficient devices, that you're looking at the returns, trying to figure out whether to reinvest it in more solar panels or something else. And this, no question, this takes time and effort from people in their everyday lives. And, nothing comes without any effort, but the effort and time that goes into being an enterprise, to watching what you're spending and what you're taking in, is a very specific kind of effort. And, I think in some cases it does risk limiting that freedom that would come maybe from another way of going about things. So it's a conditioned empowerment. It does give citizens some power, but it also puts them in some more precarious situations as well. And finally, that there is an unclear environmental outcome, right? And to come back to it again, there is uh, no enforceable limit. There's no guarantee that those greenhouse gas emissions reductions will get there. There's only the assumption that the market will deliver them if we can kind of get these enterprises off the ground. Um, there's no accounting for sort of a growth in demand that overcomes those efficiency gains and those source transitions, or the Jevons paradox, or any of these other kinds of things. Right. And at the same time, citizens spending all their energy on this kind of enterprise lifestyle to produce green energy might get fatigued, or they might get a false sense of action on environmental crises like climate change that go beyond just the question of solar panels on your house. Finally, I think there's a dilution of citizenship here, where these social goals of a sustainable society that we might be trying to achieve really become a kind of market participation. We're not participating in a political process anymore, but in a personal entrepreneurial one. Um, and finally, there's a move, I think, from a scientific and political control of a political environmental situation to one of market management, right? Science tells us we how much we can emit, how much greenhouse gases we can reasonably expect to emit before we start to see various consequences. And, politics could make those limits hard, but instead we just kind of turn that question of scientific and political control over to the dynamics of competition, the dynamics of the market. Now, all of that said, there is some good news. And this is about the end of it, and we'll move to some questions then. So this is a news story that was circulating at various outlets last week. Wind and solar overtake fossil fuels in the EU power supply in 2025. And this is a nice chart that they've put in there and that I've reproduced for you here, where you can see on the left-hand side sort of fossil fuels, 42.8% of electricity production in Europe in 2015, down to 29% of electricity production in Europe in 2025. And then nuclear has stayed about the same, hydro has stayed about the same, other renewable like biomass has stayed about the same, but solar and wind have moved from 12.7% in 2015 up to 30.1% of European electricity production in 2025. So that's a pretty dramatic transition over 10 years. So whatever criticisms or whatever hesitations I might have raised, there's no question that so far some results are being achieved. Um, All right. Has anybody got any questions or things they want to talk about? Or
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a really great presentation. And also for being on time. So we have time for questions. Because this is taped, can you please raise your hand and then we'll come to you with the microphone so you can ask questions. I have a couple of questions, but of course you come first. So I think it was Piotr and then Ethan and then August and then Tristan.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
August.
I can, yes.
Yeah, okay. So, my question is, so during your presentation, you established that like the main purpose of the rec communities is not profit driven, but more to provide community benefits and social benefits. So my question is, like, what's the incentive here for the average European? How do you encourage them to alter the way they consume energy on a daily basis?
Do you want to take
Right.
one by one?
However you want to do it. I can't.
Yeah, let's do one by one.
Sounds great. So I think that language in the legal definition of the wreck is really aimed at stopping they've done everything they can to stop um, a purely kind of financial control of these energy communities, right? So the fact that they have to be autonomous, the fact that they have to be local, right? Miami can't invest in an American version of that in the energy communities in Ocala with their outsized funds or something like this, right? Compared to the people in Ocala. The people in Ocala have to maintain control of that. And I read that lack of profit-driven motive in the same way. On one hand, that there's got to be really no incentive in these kind of entities if they're going to get the kinds of subsidies, because there's a lot of various programs to help promote them. They really can't be profit driven in any of these ways. They want to really prevent any kind of abuse scenarios of these kind of communities. And again, to ensure that the people who are investing in them with their personal savings uh, really do maintain control of how that energy is used. And the second part of it, sometimes there's the possibility, of course, eventually the goal is to make it all dynamic pricing, but sometimes, they can decide what price they want to sell the surplus energy at. And at a certain point, if they're setting the prices too high, they could lose their status as a renewable energy community. Um, so it can't be financially driven in this way, but people do it for, I mean, among the people that I talk to, they have all kinds of motives. Many, it's a genuine kind of political, ethical motive, um, uh, in the sense that this has to be done. We can participate in it. This is what we can do, and we would like to do that, and we're willing to give our time for it. But just because it's not financial in the sense of producing profits doesn't mean it doesn't make financial good sense, right? That people's household costs really do go down um, when they have their own energy supply on their roof. They sink the money in, but 10 years later, they're making money compared to where they would have been otherwise. So that's not a profit-driven thing, but it does make financially good sense for the individual or for the household. Um, and it does give more security. Communities that had access to their own local energy uh, fared a lot better when the energy shocks after the Ukraine war came and energy prices were going up in Europe like crazy. People who had access to local solar, to local wind through their renewable energy communities ended up, paying a lot less than the going market rate at that point. So that's not a profit-driven approach, but it is one that keeps money in your wallet. And this is, if you look at the discourse, if we take an organization like rescoup.eu, which is the biggest organization promoting renewable energy communities in Europe, and you look at their advertising isn't about do something great for the environment, do something great for climate change. Their advertising is all about save yourself some money, live more responsibly. We can, right now you're paying money to Électricité de France, and it's costing you too much, and it's just these big executives taking your paycheck when you could actually be producing your energy yourself. So there can be financial incentives without there being kind of a profit motive. Sorry, that was a long-winded question, but that's how I am.
Thank you. That's a good example. So there's certainly some of this prepper mentality, right? And sort of energy resilience going on as motivation as well. I think next it was Ethan and then Augustine. Yeah. Oh, or sorry, Augustine, then we go down to you. Yeah.
My question is, these policies deal with energy and emissions. If you're also dealing with emissions, do you not also deal with the industrial capacity of Europe? And another question is, Europe only accounts for around 6% of world CO2 emissions. Does further policies which damage the job market in Europe through higher energy costs for production really benefit Europe? Would those industries not move to, let's say, countries like China or Africa, which have laxer policies on emissions, which would then produce a net increase on CO2 pollution in the world?
Did you get that?
Yeah.
Can I quickly add to that? Build on that. I was also wondering, you mentioned the role of big energy like FPL, right? And suppressing sort of, in Florida, solar energy users. What's the role of big energy like Électricité de France or RWE in Germany? They're probably also not looking at this very favorably. So because it relates to your first part of the question.
Right. I'll try and cover everything if I tell me if I miss something as I'm going. So that is an important framework to keep mentally this talk within. Is really this talk is just and the clean energy package is really just talking about electricity production. It doesn't deal with emissions in transport. It doesn't deal with agricultural emissions. It doesn't deal with other sectors as well. There are other policies that deal with those. But really, this is just a small subset of, I think, a key one and maybe the key one for Europe, but it doesn't account for all of the emissions that are happening. Second, I think it really depends on going to the question of only 6%. The studies that I've looked at would put it, well, there's just one. There's a really great paper by, he's become a bit famous now, French economist Thomas Piketty and a colleague of his, Lucas Chancel. And what they did was they took, normally when we calculate a country's emissions, we only calculate what they produce in that country. And they said, that's not quite correct. If it's someone in the United States who's buying the Apple computer or whatever, then those emissions should actually be on the United States budget as well. So they redid the whole global emissions based on consumption rather than production. And there, of course, what you see is India and China are very small producers. It's really the consumption patterns of North America in particular, but also of Europe, and the emissions go way up. India and China become smaller players in that regard because they're simply producing things for other people. And if it's the other people who are using them, those are really their emissions. And in that sense, that 6% is potentially a bit bigger, but of course, local energy production doesn't necessarily account for the emissions that are raised from foreign production of goods. So that gets a bit more complicated. But of course, if the energy prices do come down, as the goal is in the long run, and they become more secure, then it does make sense to start keeping industry at home, both for security reasons, security of supply lines, right? There was the sort of backlog of supply chains from COVID, which some places still haven't recovered from these kinds of things, the more kind of like local production you can have. That's really, in some ways an economic issue, but in some ways a security issue. And people are willing to pay a higher price for those kinds of things. And the role of big energy. It's interesting. I mean, I can't speak for all of them because there are all of these different ones. If I remember, one that I was looking at a few years ago was, I think Vattenfall has a kind of, I mean, they'll sell you traditional energy, but they'll also sell you solar energy. And you can just kind of get the same bill, but you get it from, they tell you from solar energy rather than from wherever else they were producing the energy before. And I think that this is, again, there's two ways to read that. On one hand, it's a way to kind of keep control in the big concerns' hands, keep control and keep profits, while sucking up people who might have otherwise, put solar on their house, but that's a lot of work, and so I'll just kind of buy solar from a major concern. But on the other hand, we could read it at the same time as it proves the competitiveness of the renewable energy communities. If more and more large energy concerns find themselves forced to offer these kinds of alternatives to consumers that might come with renewable benefits but don't come with the political governance benefits, then perhaps this is proof that there is something behind the EU's drive to put it really in the hands of consumers and of local producers.
Great, thank you. So Ethan, please.
Professor Anfinson, thank you so much for the lecture and for the insights. My name is Ethan Bazak, and my question is primarily about the role of industry. You mentioned legislation, how difficult it is to really get everybody on board. Though possible, it's going to be a difficult journey. So my question really is targeted at making companies prioritize innovation through research and development. And the question regarding the European Union is, what is the European Union actively doing through subsidies, for example, to promote research and development, to create innovations that will hopefully reduce the footprint that every household produces, to make renewable energy more feasible in the future when we're producing or we're demanding less energy?
I think that the scope of what they're doing goes far beyond what I know. That there are so many programs and I think that, again, this, I would count this Comres program that I was part of as being among those that are trying to put money into different experiments at the local levels to incentivize. So if a very, very big company wouldn't be a part of a energy community, but if you have what they call an SME or a small or medium enterprise that does have kind of a big warehouse or a big factory in a village, and they can be part of a renewable energy community, and they might just give the roof space. They've got a huge roof. They give the roof space. People in the community invest money to buy the solar panels. They both share governance over what happens with the energy of those solar panels. And they get to use some of it for their production, which also helps their costs, but the community gets access to that electricity as well, particularly in hours which when the factory is not working and the warehouse isn't working. And so I think the model itself of a renewable energy community, in allowing for kind of small businesses and small enterprises to participate, does capture some of that. But I think that there's all kinds of money being put into research. There's all kinds of money being put into technological development, but also social development. Again, why in a place like Thuringia, which has good access to wind, is there not more wind? What are the cultural kind of reasons? What are the socioeconomic reasons? and how can we kind of overcome those? And that's part of what we were doing, is kind of sitting down with these people, talking to them, look at the different drivers, and writing these reports. So I think it's happening on a lot of different levels, and that's why it couldn't be put into just a list of 3 or even 30 projects. It's really a very broad effort.
Thank you. Next was August.
Also want to thank you for the lecture. It's been very informative. My mother works with the Orlando Utilities Commission back home, and she's talked to me about this issue specifically, specifically with paying for surplus energy produced by solar. And she told me it's not an issue of bankruptcy, obviously, for the company, but it is an issue when it comes to where they direct their money, specifically for maintenance and investment. And really, the question is, how are we going to help maintain a decentralized grid? Like, is there a plan for doing so and protect production in what would be a more volatile energy market?
I'm not sure that I totally caught the question there. If you wouldn't mind repeating it just one more time.
No worries. But some companies are being focused to spend more on the paying back surplus for solar and pay into a decentralized grid that would be harder to maintain, and cut back simultaneously on cost of maintenance because they're paying into it. Is there a framework for solving this kind of problem?
Tell me if I think I've got the question, but tell me if I've not got you, and we'll try again. That there is a kind of, particularly in the US, that very often the private utilities are paying for the grid maintenance that then individual consumers become users of when they sell electricity back onto that, and that the companies sometimes feel that that's a bit unfair, to be paying for the foundation that in fact could be seen as undermining their business in a certain way. And there's various solutions for that. One option which sits on the side and which we haven't discussed here today is the role of kind of public utilities. So there are also municipalities in Europe who have bought the power generation from a private enterprise back, and they use it. So energy is a public good, not a private good anymore, and the grids can be treated in the same way, that they are public good. And you can also, you can factor in. So this is one option, right? That's and it's an alternative as well to renewable energy communities, right? The state could say, well, instead of kind of trying to spur market growth, we're going to ourselves guarantee the production of a certain amount of solar by building solar and wind infrastructures here and there. We're going to do it in a top-down way, and in that way, we're going to try and guarantee that we hit these kind of targets. Would be an alternative approach, but it's easy to work out even in a more kind of privatized grid, in the sense that you pay a chunk, even when you're selling electricity back, you still pay some grid usage tax on that, right? So a small fee that you pay in to use some of that grid gets incorporated into it as well. So it's not really, if I understood you right, I don't think there's much of a fairness case to be made that's not easily overcome. Was that what you were asking, or am I totally off?
I do understand the perspective for this, but more specifically, when it comes to investing in greener energy with less money to do so for these corporations, not necessarily corporations, but the commission, specifically for OUC's situation, they are a publicly owned corporation, which citizens vote as a board of directors pretty much for that. But they still have the issues of paying for costs and such like that. But in a decentralized grid, they don't necessarily have the maintenance for that. So while their interest is for the majority of people, they have the issue of being able to pay for majority of people when they don't have the money to do so. I'm
Yeah,
phrasing
so
it
I guess
correctly.
the suggestion was basically, right, put some of that cost onto the consumers who uses the
Yes.
grid.
Yeah, that's
So
right. So it's
yeah,
not, it wasn't a fairness perspective
yeah.
question, but it was a good answer.
I mean, I don't know about you, but it's kind of like similar. I wanted to get FPL to have solar energy, and they have this program, right, where you pay like $5 a month more to get, energy supposedly from FPL solar farms or whatever. I heard ambivalent things about that, but I think that's kind of like, right, you pay as a consumer a little bit more for the different usage of the grid. Yep. Okay, good. So we're at 4:07. We have any other questions, guys? Please. Okay, there are a few more questions. Can we go around here to you both? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Just to know, considering the current geopolitical situation in Europe, do you see projects like REC in the future becoming as more of security tools rather than economic or environmental initiatives?
Well, I think that at least based on the language that the EU Commission uses, they have always from the beginning thought of them as security tools. They have always seen them as resilience to energy shocks, and it's really hard. There's not really clear data about the impact of the Ukraine war, but most of the data seems to suggest that it's accelerated renewable energy development by 1 to 5%. Of course, in a very costly and troublesome way, right? There were a couple painful years. Um, uh, and in some places, the energy prices are still quite a bit above what they were. And building of new infrastructure to accommodate more American LNG and stuff like so. It's not been a perfect process, but it's very clear that if they'd been um, further along, they would have been more resilient to these external shocks. And in that sense, it very much is a security concern. The more that, every country is kind of trying to always thinking a little bit about energy independence, especially ones that don't have, local coal or local natural gas or local oil reserves to use in these ways. But, this seems to be um, uh, the counterbalance to that is, of course, that if I read, for example, um, I think Germany's been very good about hitting their targets, and it looks like they might not make them this time. And I don't think it's an accident that there's more interest in kind of physical rearmament and this kind of stuff in Germany and moving public funds away. So security gets interpreted in different ways, and if security moves in kind of like the weapons and warfare direction, then that's obviously going to suck away some funding from what might go to promoting these kinds of programs. But as long as the discourse around security, which is legitimate, is thought of in terms of energy independence and less reliance on foreign sources, then I think politicians who favor these kind of renewable energy alternatives have good kind of political ammunition that they can use to kind of maintain funding levels. Whether that will actually be the way the politics plays out or not, that kind of independence and resilience will be to weigh the kind of physical external threat discourses. I could not comment on it.
Yeah, this whole energy autonomy discourse that's emerging now, right? Yes, please. We have two more questions. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Professor. My question is more on how the EU is using their climate ambition and plans and how they're handling the risk of social backlash, especially from like low-income households and poorer regions in Europe that still depend on fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's I'll try and give two quick answers since we're kind of running out of time. And I think there's one question. The first is that, as we saw in the Rex definition, you can use it, it can't be a financial goal, it can be kind of like a social goal. And there are recs that are precisely focused on questions of social equality, questions of access, and who work that into their active program that we're trying to give access to neighborhoods, to cities that might not traditionally have had access to it or might not have the surplus financially to be able to invest in local solar. So this is an active concern that's being thought about, that's being worked on, and that is being incorporated in different places. The other question is a bigger one, and of course, if we take that last chart and you actually look at the countries, this of course is not an evenly distributed balance of wind and solar, right? It's very unbalanced between the various countries, and I think particularly former or like Eastern European ones are particularly still fossil fuel driven. We had partners in Poland on the ComRes project, and they were included as a region that is quite far behind and has a lot of obstacles to overcome in terms of being able to develop these energy communities. So that, again, that kind of difference between states and regions rather than socioeconomic neighborhoods is being accounted for as well and is being worked on. But of course, that's a bit slower. But it's also, right, the targets that they're trying to reach are binding for the EU as a whole but not for the individual member states. And there are as well efforts. No one expects kind of like some countries to move as fast as Spain might, or as Germany might, or as fast as the Netherlands might. And so that's built into the considerations as well, even if it hasn't, necessarily been able to produce quite the spur of compensation in other countries. But they're well-known problems. Sorry, go ahead.
And with the amount of money that the EU, at least in the past, has provided, right? There's plenty of financial incentives even for folks who need to a little bit more convincing, right?
Yeah, you get these disproportionate financial to try and get people to even more incentive to commit to it and start working on it.
Right. And then last but not least, we have one more question. So thank you very much for taking. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't want to prolong this any longer, but I just wanted to ask, because I was wondering about what you said before, how citizens can benefit from this, just like regular citizens. However, is there any assurance that since it's controlled by market management, it will not just move towards policies that are profitable for them, even though we've been assured that they're not for economic benefits? Because pollution already starts because of profitable solutions that they don't have to spend much money on. How is there any assurance, since enforcement is pretty weak from what we've seen, that this will not just move towards what private investments will be able to do for less money to gain more? Thank you.
I mean, it's early in the process. Who knows exactly what will happen and what people will come up with. But my sense is that there's, the incentives and are so directed, and the language is so strong already around kind of like local autonomy and these kinds of things. And you have to think about that it's hard to make that transition without, you're sitting there with 30 of your neighbors, and you have to vote on the energy price that you want to sell it at, and you're going to have to convince all of your neighbors that this should really be a profit thing as well. And then, of course, you can lose your status as kind of like a renewable energy community, right? If you actually become an entity producing energy primarily for a profit, and you get legally recategorized in that way, then all of a sudden you're a business, and your obligations for reporting and taxation and all of this change quite a lot. So I don't think that's a large risk at the moment, would be my read of the situation.
Okay, great. I think we could have talked much longer, but thank you very much for giving us so much information and for engaging in the Q&A. Please give a big round of applause to Professor Anfinson. Hope you can hear that. Sorry you couldn't be here with us today, but maybe there's a chance in the near future, right? And stay warm, right, up north, and go green. And to my students, you know what to do Friday, right? Your discussion post based on today's lecture, and I'll be in touch regarding next week's class and the quiz at the beginning of next week's class, okay? So prepare for that as well. Thank you. Thank you very much again, Professor Anfinson.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the lovely questions.